you've raised a point there, because you're talking about the previous reports, all well-intentioned, but not really much practical outcome to it. But all of these ideas you've got and all of the things that you wish to pursue do rely on one other element, and that's the public's own cooperation and understanding.
Yeah, it does.
How do you get this through to them? Because people, none so deaf as those who won't hear.
No, and I think, again, this shows how we've learned as public health professionals over the years. When I first came into public health, which is 30 years ago now, we still had the old model of health education, health promotion. And the health education end of that very much was based on, if we tell people what they should do and that that's good for them, they will do it. Exactly. So the means of operating for that was very much around posters, leaflets, big campaigns, to get everybody aware of what they should do, and then they would do it. And as we know, they don't. So we don't do that anymore. And I have to say, I do sometimes get some flack for that. I get people saying, why don't you still have your health promotion resources unit? We need those posters and leaflets. Well, actually, no, you don't, because everybody knows what they should be doing. And that was really brought home to me when a few years ago now, I was doing a piece of research work with patients who were morbidly obese and were waiting to have the surgery, the bariatric surgery for their obesity. And we were doing, a focus group with them, really sort of asking, what has been your experience of how you've got to this point in your life's journey? And, what could have been done differently to turn that round? And they were saying, in fact, they made a joke of it. They were saying, we know everything we ought to have done, and we can tell you. We probably know it better than you do. And they proceeded to do exactly that and tell me all about the dietary advice, the exercise advice, etc. And they said, if we could do it, we would. Now, one could take a very sort of judgmental activity and say, well, it's you that's eating the pies, mate, so just stop doing it. But actually, it's not as easy as that. Most people who are overweight or obese know they are and would actually like to address it.
Is that figure I gave right? 61% of our society is basically too fat.
They're overweight or obese, yeah.
And that is what? Too much food? How much of that is genetic?
Genetic has a role in there. I think when you look at families, and often you do find that overweight or obesity runs in families, the major portion of that is really cultural. It's how they relate to food, how food is used as pleasure, getting together, etc., etc. Genetics does play a role. There are all sorts of interesting things that we don't know enough about yet around obesity. There's all the interesting stuff about hormones, so insulin, ghrelin, leptin. Yes, there is stuff that we will be learning about that, but I think the thing is we can't just sit back and say, oh, well, we don't know enough yet. Don't worry if you're overweight or obese now. Maybe in a few years' time we'll know more about hormones and we can do something different.
I've heard it frequently said that actually during the war years, when food was very limited, therefore people ate perhaps not as much and a little more carefully, people actually were healthier.
They were. Yeah.
So it's the supply for. You talked about takeaways. I'm surprised how many convenience shops survive. To be honest, there's that many of them. But we had the programme last week which referred to the food bank, and we were discussing it. What surprised me was the number of people they discovered didn't know how to process food and lived a lot on fast foods.
Yeah.
There was no cooking skills. Didn't even have a cooker in some instances in the house.
Yeah.
So there's a background issue which is not just with the eating of it.
Absolutely. And that goes back to the wider determinants. When you mentioned there that there are people who don't even have cooking facilities, that links then into issues around homelessness or people who are only able to live in really very poor quality accommodation, where at most they have maybe a single electric ring to cook on. Some people may only have a kettle, and then all they can do is do a pot noodle or maybe boil an egg in the kettle. And clearly that's not acceptable, and it's not a good way to have to live your life, not only in terms of your diet, but also in terms of emotional and mental well-being, your ability to be an active part of society and everything else. So these are some of the issues that we need to address. And obviously it's no good telling people how they ought to eat if actually their circumstances mean that they can't.